Thank you for joining us for the Ask Me Anything virtual session with Brandon Burns, Kubernetes co-founder and corporate VP of Azure OSS Cloud Native at Microsoft. Today's session is a panel AMA, and Brendan is joined by Microsoft engineering leads Sean McKenna, Lachlan Evenson, and Bridget Kromhout as moderator. Before I get into the panel intros, let me cover a few things for today's session. Please take a moment to read over our code of conduct. We ask that you be kind and respectful to everyone, including our speakers. We want the reactors to be a place everyone feels welcome. Please ask questions using the live YouTube chat. In the chat, we'll also be sharing some links to the Reactor Meetup page and monthly newsletters if you're interested in checking out what other sessions we have coming up. If you haven't already, please check in using our event check-in at aka.ms/reactor check-in with event ID 14537. Today's session will be added to our Reactor YouTube page in 24 to 48 hours. And finally, I will be sharing a link to our Reactor survey. If you have a few minutes, we greatly appreciate your feedback. I would now like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Brendan.
Hi there, I'm Brendan Burns. I am a corporate vice president these days at Microsoft Azure, focusing on open source and cloud native compute on Azure and DevOps generally. And long ago, I helped create this whole thing, I guess.
So it's your fault.
It's pretty much my fault. That's right. Right.
All right, perfect. I will now hand it over to Sean.
Hey everybody, I'm Sean McKenna. I'm a group product manager responsible for our Kubernetes services in Azure. So that encompasses both the Azure Kubernetes service, which will probably be the bulk of what we're talking about today, as well as the Azure Red Hat OpenShift service, which is obviously built on top of Kubernetes as a foundation. So drive the product roadmap and strategy for Kubernetes on Azure broadly.
Great. Lachlan, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name's Lachlan Evenson. I'm a PM on the Azure upstream team, where we work on cloud native open source and in bringing that to both our customers and the community. So we work on things like Kubernetes. So if you're actually at KubeCon, I'm here physically. So come up and say hi. I'll be at the booth later this afternoon.
Wonderful. And then Bridget is our moderator today. Bridget, can you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I am a PM in the upstream open source team, working with Lachlan and a bunch of other fine folks on upstream Kubernetes, and of course, working directly with McKenna's team on making it run the best on Azure. I've been very focused lately here at KubeCon on, spoiler alert, there's so much exciting things happening, so many exciting things in the Kubernetes networking space. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to talk to these folks.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for the intros. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Bridget, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Brendan, I'm going to start with you since you claimed responsibility. So if you're responsible for all of these things, all of the everythings, can you tell us about some key trends you're seeing in Kubernetes right now, like Kubernetes, the broader cloud native community, and how specifically the things that Azure is talking about at KubeCon this time fit into the trends that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest trend that we're looking, or maybe two trends that are interplayed together. One is really the evolution and maturation of the ecosystem on top, right? So the Kubernetes API at this point, unchanged for several years. I mean, it changes, but it doesn't really change. Except for all those deprecations that break our customers.
Yeah, I was going to say, except for the breaking changes, but it's fine.
But we have warnings now, and actually I think that's part of it. So we're doing things like actually in Azure warning people if they're using deprecated APIs. I think there's a real focus on helping make it easier. And whether that's in the ecosystem with projects like operators coming along, making it easier to run software, projects like policy, making the gatekeeper project that we work on, making it easier to manage your cluster. there's a real focus, I think, on the breadth developer is coming or already arrived, and we need to make sure that they're successful, because as fantastic and awesome as it is to see this community grow, I don't think it lasts if we don't sustain it for 80-90% of the developer audience that's out there. Right? They've come because we've promised them a bunch of stuff. This is now the time when we really have to deliver on those promises. And I'm pretty excited about a lot of the effort that, Microsoft and Azure have put in, whether it's in supply chain or developer experience, VS Code, whatever it happens to be, to just kind of try and make the whole landscape easier to comprehend.
Yeah, very well put. That makes so much sense. And we're really leading in this space with, on the keynote stage today, you can see right there, Lachlan is wearing a suit coat, which means he was obviously on a keynote stage. Lachlan, can you tell us a little bit, give us the short version of this Azure's involvement in the Dualstack networking for Kubernetes and what people can try today?
Yeah, of course. So I was on stage earlier today, just sharing the journey about this new feature that's landing as a stable feature in 1.23 of Kubernetes called Dualstack. Now, if you haven't heard of what Dualstack is before, it allows you to sign not only IPv4, which is probably what you're using today on Kubernetes, but IPv6 network addresses. Now, you might be asking, why does that matter and why is that of interest to me? What we're seeing is a large number of folks in the community and customers. For example, yesterday, AT&T was talking about their strategy and why they're believing and investing in cloud native. And, with the advent of 5G and AT&T and cloud providers and telcos actually looking to Kubernetes to solve their runtime challenges, IPv6 is actually a regulatory requirement for them to have that because they need to scale and have access to the IPv6 internet. So the journey I took on stage today, this has been a 4-year process and a collaboration between many companies in the ecosystem, and Microsoft's been leading that work, and we're finally seeing it go stable. So, and alongside that, you can now actually deploy in private preview Dualstack Networking enabled AKS clusters. So we are actually showing that off. So if you're interested in taking a look at how Dualstack networking works and what you need to do and how you can start onboarding to it now, we're making that really easy in AKS to get a feel for
it. I'm really excited about the fact that the private preview of Dualstack networking is already available in AKS. And we have a question in the chat about, will Azure CNI vNext to support IPv6? Very exciting and specific question. Lachlan, do you want to field that one?
I think I'll pass it to Sean.
I figured it was coming my way. The short answer is yes. Exactly when, still TBD. So for those who are familiar with AKS, we have 2 networking modes referred to either as KubeNet and Azure CNI, or basic and advanced in some cases. And so the initial preview that we have for Dualstack is based on KubeNet, or the basic networking capability, but we are actively working with the Azure networking team to bring that same functionality into Azure CNI, because there's a lot of benefits that come from that. So stay tuned for the expansion of that scope, but we wanted to get the initial incarnation of it out for folks to start playing around with it. And we do have a ton of customers that are using KubeNet as a production networking configuration. And so we expect there will be a lot of opportunity for uptake even with the initial scope.
I'm really excited about that because, of course, in private preview, people still have this expectation that they're going to have a good experience, and you've been able to get that ready and deliver it, and people will be able to get started. They've been waiting and waiting, and now they can finally get started on AKS with Dualstack. So that's fantastic. But there's a lot more than that going on, McKenna. So can you tell us a little bit, like there's things going on with Azure's portal experience for developers, tools like Bridge to Kubernetes. Like, where do you see, Brendan was referring to developer experience. What's your vision for where the AKS developer experience is going?
Yeah, it's a good question because there is a lot of stuff going on, and I would say one of the things that we're trying to do is take a bunch of those investments and pull them together into a cohesive whole. So if you look at things like we've got the Kubernetes extension for VS Code, as well as the AKS specific extension in VS Code, we've got tools like Deployment Center inside of the Azure portal to create CI/CD workflows, right out of the gate from your project. You mentioned Bridget Kubernetes. So there's a bunch of kind of tying together of those different capabilities that we're looking to do. I think there's a few kind of principles that we're looking at as we do that. One is, as you say, making it easy to get started for developers. And I think one of the classic examples of that is we launched, probably 6-7 months ago now, the portal experience for being able to view Kubernetes resources directly inside of the Azure portal. And one of the capabilities that we have in there is, in addition to being able to view the resources already in the cluster that is just pulling directly from the Kubernetes API server, is you actually have the opportunity to go in and edit and create resources directly through the portal. Now, we had a lot of discussion about that experience because there was sort of this tension of like, hey, is that actually an anti-pattern that we're suggesting people to go into the portal and create resources and edit things? And what we came down to was, yeah, that's not a thing you want to be doing in production in the long run. But for somebody who's a brand new developer who's just heard all the excitement around Kubernetes, wants to be able to come and just quickly get a cluster spun up, deploy a workflow, copy paste something from documentation, get something spun up, be able to hit an endpoint, kind of the classic 5 minutes, 0 to hero kind of scenario, having that capability right there inside of the portal to be able to play around, get a feel for the API, get a feel for the resources and sort of the hierarchy, and then go from there to having a full-fledged, proper CI/CD sort of immutable kind of model, we thought was the right kind of workflow. So trying to make it easy to get started, but then having that smooth path into configurations that are more production grade. So we think a lot about how we kind of walk that fine line, because obviously that is something really critical. We're also looking at things like how can we optimize the sets of workloads and scenarios that we know developers are having to do quite frequently, right? So a classic case is you want to build a web service, a web application that needs to scale based on some custom metric for the application, right? Request per second as a classic example. That's actually much harder than you would expect today inside of Kubernetes, even though it's a really canonical scenario for a brand new developer, right? So we're looking at ways that we can build those types of capabilities in as really opinionated workflows. So you can leverage things like the Kubernetes event-driven auto-scaling project that we've been spearheading out in the community and bake that in to the platform. So there's just a really easy way to get a custom metric published and then use that as your scale factor. And so really trying to have that kind of smooth on-ramp into the platform so that developers are not left with, okay, I spun up a cluster, I'm all excited, and then now what, right? And
the classic now what?
Exactly, go up the very steep learning curve, right? So build some of that momentum into the platform so you can start to see the power of it and get that little bit of endorphin rush, if you will, from being productive with it, so that then you've got that momentum to go into learning some of the heavier weight concepts.
Absolutely. You got to lower that mean time to dopamine.
Exactly.
Awesome. So you're mentioning a bunch of the exciting new things out there, and it makes me want to ask Brendan one of the questions from the chat. If we're looking at, Microsoft, Orleans, I don't even know how to say this. Orleans. Dapper, Aconet. When people are deciding which of these exciting new things they're going to use, can you kind of give us a sense of how did they decide and which ones should they get started with? Or is there something else along this realm that they haven't even thought about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think we definitely are big believers that choice is valuable and important, right? And so I think in a lot of what Sean is talking about, at some level as a developer, you have to decide, is this an area that I deeply care about, or am I just after some functionality? The things they named are basically 3 actor patterns. And Because if it's an area you deeply care about, you may invest and you may say, hey, Akka, or hey, Dapper, or hey, Orleans, and there's different reasons for choosing those different environments. I think that in many cases, though, what we have done is we've forced people to make choices on those axes. And in many cases, they honestly don't care. They're like, I want you to deliver me an event into my code and tell me how to write my code to respond to that event. And I really don't care if it's Akka or Orleans or Dapper, but what I care about is like that you tested the whole thing, and that when Dapper 1.5 comes around, it's going to keep working. And when, and when I change, if I change from Java to C++ or whatever else, I'm going to have the same kind of experience, right? And so I think what we're really talking about isn't necessarily trying to prescribe specific choices for places that you care. We want to leave it open for you to decide in those spaces. I think that what we're really trying to do is, for all of the places where you don't care, provide you with a solution that works. And so, in the particular case of this question, we are actually integrating Dapper into AKS so that you can install the admissions controller and you can really easily inject Dapper into AKS. And I think, a lot of the motivation for that is both that, Dapper is pretty polyglot, which is nice. Both Orleans and Akka are kind of tied to specific languages, .NET in the case of Orleans, and Java variants in the case of Akka. And Dapper is totally language independent, but it also has more capabilities than just actors. And so if you're talking about AKS as a general purpose platform, it makes sense to add, this developer productivity enhancement sidecar that allows for different kinds of developer productivity enhancement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when we start looking at those tools that can help people be more productive, we have some questions in the chat that I'm going to look to McKenna, because people are talking about, what if I want to have some serverless? What if I want to have some AI/ML? And when we were talking earlier, I was thinking, hey, we should be talking about the preview support for those WASI node pools and crosslet in AKS, get some WebAssembly in there. I feel like there's an awful lot of shiny things there. McKenna, do you want to talk a little bit about where you think that stuff is going in terms of customer workflows? It might be a customer will say, I just want some serverless. No, they have something they're trying to accomplish. So yeah, can you talk about what you're seeing there?
Yeah, it's another area where we're sort of trying to walk the fine line. When we think about serverless as an example, we do have today the AKS virtual nodes capability built on top of Azure container instances. It's a great model for scale bursting into that serverless model to get a very quick scale of additional pods. But there's a bunch of limitations that exist as well, just based on the fact that it is not a traditional Kubernetes node. And so we try to find that sweet spot where there's a set of workloads that can work, things like stateless microservices that don't need to be mounting disks and taking other dependencies on things that are more challenging to run in that kind of shared environment. We kind of continue to chip away at those limitations to try to expand the scope of what can run there. But I think in general, what we're trying to do is take away some of the operational complexity in the cases where customers don't get a lot of benefit from it. So abstracting as much of the infrastructure as possible through things like ACI, while still giving customers access to the power and the capabilities of the Kubernetes API, because that's really where Brendan talked earlier about the maturing and the growth of the ecosystem. That ecosystem is ultimately built on top of that Kubernetes API. And so we feel like customers still are looking for, even though it can in some cases bring a lot of complexity, having that power at their fingertips to be able to leverage that full ecosystem is important. And then what we need to do is layer on top of that some of those opinionated workflows for those common scenarios that customers are looking to accomplish, such that you don't always have to be looking at the full box of Legos, right? You have at least a picture of what you're trying to accomplish and some pre-built sets. that you can do, which then you can take apart afterwards if you want and reconfigure them. But at least it's easier to get rolling initially.
Yeah. And I saw Brendan smile when I said WebAssembly. So I'm gonna ask him to add on to what you just said and say, hey, what's Microsoft doing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think WebAssembly is a great example of a place where we're really trying to facilitate our customers, and really, frankly, anyone who's interested in the technology exploring it. Right? I think WebAssembly has some really interesting potential use cases. I think that most of them at this point, as I've seen them, are more speculative than in actual practice. But the other thing that I noticed, because I kick around with this stuff sometimes, is it was just painful. Like I was getting involved in WebAssembly, and I felt like literally I was back in sort of mid-late 1990s, like make, configure, CMake kind of days, right? And I think a lot of what we've done in integrating it with the Crustlet and into AKS is just really simplify people's ability to come in, play around with this, and see if this is a tech that is going to be useful for their use case. And we've done a lot of leadership as well in the WASI spec around, what does it look like to build, to go from WebAssembly to something that is more server side. And so I think it's just a really great way to simplify a different kind of developer experience, which is that, prototype phase or that exploration phase where sometimes you let go of something just because it was too hard, not because it didn't have promise, but just because it was too hard to turn it into a solution that worked for you. And so I'm really excited about that. I think we've been leading the way there, kind of like the IPv6. And I think it shows our breadth as well, right? That we can be down in the depths of IP land and thinking about dual stack and touching literally, I mean, if you look at any of Cal's, I don't know if Lachie talked about his PRs, but I mean, those PRs touch like every single part of the Kubernetes API, right? To this much more sort of like high level, very developer focused tech that we're running on top of these Kubernetes APIs. I think that's a great demonstration of the breadth of our sort of our open source capabilities and interests, frankly. And then I think also it's a really nice demonstration also of another trend that I didn't mention at the beginning, which is that, I think we used to talk a lot about like cloud and edge or like on-prem and cloud or the transition to cloud or whatever it is. And I think what we've really seen throughout the Kubernetes work, the work on Azure Arc, the work with WebAssembly and beyond is that it's a continuum, right? Like it's not, you don't deploy to cloud and deploy to on-prem. It's like you deploy to the world. And I think with WebAssembly, we're also really excited about the idea that you could conceivably, and we have some demos of this, take something like ML inference and go from literally a $2 microcontroller all the way up to a $10,000 GPU instance with the same code, but obviously with better inference on one device and less inference on the other. I think there's a bunch of use cases in that scenario that are really exciting as we really think about like how do we bring a great developer experience to the whole of what your application is.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And McKenna, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of double down on what Brendan was saying in terms of it being speculative. I think it's important to call out to customers that this is, there's a set of things that we add to the product where we've watched thousands of customers try to do it and it's too hard, and therefore we go and try to make it better. Or we've talked to thousands of customers, they've said, I need to do XYZ and I need your product to help me do it. So we go add those things to the product. This is a little bit different, right? Where we see potential, we see the opportunities in terms of things like building these very small applications to run on the tiny edge, and then having them kind of follow that continuum into the cloud. But at this point, we're kind of looking for customers to help us kind of crystallize what those really key scenarios are, and if there's enough there for us to go and do even more in that space, right? So this is kind of an interesting case where we're sort of throwing something out there that we think has potential. We want people to kick the tires with it and let us know what they think and help us, figure out how to take it forward. And so we're really excited about having that breadth of capabilities in the product, from the things that are like I say, thousands of people have asked us for it, to the ones where it's really more bleeding edge.
I really appreciate the fact that Azure is, as someone said in the chat, leading the way there. I think that we're kind of doing the, Wayne Gretzky thing. We're skating to where the puck is going to be, which, that's what we want to do. We had a question in the chat that made me want to hand it off to Lachlan, and I want to ask you about service mesh, specifically because Brendan made me think about the things that are hard and things that are messy and the things that maybe it's easier if you can get some help with it. And there's a lot going on with Open Service Mesh right now. And then, of course, there's questions about how it works, and we can go into the detail on that. I'm wondering, Lachlan, if you want to talk a little bit about what's going on with Open Service Mesh and how that plays into like AKS add-ons.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bridget. So OSM, Open Service Mesh, has been out there in the cloud native community. It's a CNCF project that we've been working on. And really, it was around solving the use case that we heard from customers, which was, hey, how do we actually secure connectivity and communications service to service with something like MTLS? How do we add observability? How do we add routing and some access control? And that's, that's really the goals of what a service mesh is setting out there in the first instance to kind of get after. What we did here in our journey with OSM is actually most people are still looking just for encrypted connectivity for their service to service connections. And MTLS is a big part of that. So we're hoping that integrating OSM into AKS as an add-on allows customers to get that benefit immediately, so they can go and deploy OSM today onto AKS just with a click of a button as an add-on. So we're seeing that be extremely popular way to do that. And the way that we've set that up is that you can start to selectively onboard your services as you go. So it's not a big bang approach where you have to put everything onto the service mesh at once. You can kind of piecemeal and onboard services and get a feel for how OSM functions. So that's OSM. I think stay tuned. We cut the RC yesterday. So we're hoping for a stable release, production ready, stable release very imminently. So watch this space. It's very exciting. I think to answer the question that was in the chat about Ingress Gateway for OSM specifically, we surveyed the community first of all, which is something we like to do. Has somebody already created a solution to the problem we have, and can we go and contribute to that? And when we took a look around the ecosystem, we did find that Contour would be able to meet the needs of an Ingress gateway for OSM. And we had our engineering team actually go and contribute some changes to make that happen and onboard that to OSM, which is a great collaboration story. And thanks to the maintainers of Contour for opening that opportunity up to us. So really appreciate that. And that just means there's one less piece of the puzzle that you have to install, and you can integrate it. And somebody said on stage earlier today, the great thing about CNCF projects is there is a level of integration between the projects. So I know that if I am using OSM and Contour, there is some level of interop there. So that's a great guarantee that we can provide. I think looking forward, as I've seen in the chat, there's interest in Arc and AKS, where I'm getting questions about, hey, I have several Kubernetes clusters. Could we do something along the lines of multi-cluster? And there was a keynote yesterday at KubeCon that was, where are we at with multi-cluster? And I think the consensus out of that was, hey, most people are looking for a single pane of glass to store all their service configurations across clusters, not going and doing them independently, so that they can manage a fleet of clusters and move services around and enable that connectivity. And we've modeled multi-cluster workloads in OSM, so I'm excited to see, with that being an add-on and getting more and more adoption in both the community and the customer base, we're going to be able to understand a lot more about multi-cluster and start to connect things like Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters and AKS and multiple AKS clusters. So stay tuned for that. And if you do have a use case where you're looking to use OSM, I invite you to reach out to us because we're very interested to learn about how multi-cluster might meet your needs and what your needs are. So I think it's very exciting in that front, on the service mesh front. So stay tuned, and I think you'll see a lot of action in the coming weeks.
So it's interesting that we have questions coming up in the chat about audits, security, compliance, and you mentioned, Lachlan, that strangely enough, of all the things in service mesh people want, they're very interested in the MTLS. And Brendan, we were talking earlier about the Microsoft's participating in this new open source security foundation. Supply chain security is huge. Can you talk a little bit about what your take on that is in the cloud native ecosystem broadly, Azure specifically? Can we fix everyone's SOX and PCI needs just with a click of a button? Something in the portal, right? Compliance
Actually,
now.
to be honest, that is the North Star, right? To be dead serious, I think when Sean mentioned a number of things around web serving as a canonical workload, or ML as a place where we want to smooth things. But to be honest, PCI is the exact same thing, right? And plenty of people really don't. It's undifferentiated heavy lifting, frankly, for them. And so if we can do it, and I think we can actually just provide like the PCI button. And if you look actually about the Azure policy integration that we already have with Gatekeeper and AKS, as well as with Arc, we really can provide that single pane of glass to enable people to drive policy everywhere. And I think Gatekeeper, I think there's a story that sort of resonates, I think, through a lot of our open source work and open source projects. The Dualstack work is a great example. Gatekeeper is another great example of where we're really driven by a customer problem, right? We're driven by someone coming into AKS, talking to us and saying, hey, this thing was too hard, right? Like this piece of it, I don't know how to solve it. And with Gatekeeper, a lot of it was, I don't know how to make my CISO happy, right? Like I feel torn between my business units that telling me I need agility and speed, and my customer that's telling me I need reliability, and my CISO who tells me I have to like do this specific firewall config on every virtual machine that I own, right? And so that really led to the development of the Gatekeeper project, where you could actually sort of talk to that person and say, hey, yeah, you know what, for your entire company or for a selection of teams in your company, you can set up rules so that they can't push something onto the public internet accidentally, right? Or they need to go through this process, or they can't pull images. I think I was just in a conversation this morning with talking about sort of the number of images that are still pulled from Docker Hub going out of control, right? Like somehow, and I really don't know, but somehow Docker Run made it less suspicious to download random binaries from the internet and run them on your computer, right?
Who would have thought?
And it turns out it's still a bad idea, right? It was a bad idea before Docker. It's still a bad idea. And policy is the mechanism by which you can say, hey, look, no, you have to pull images from ACR, from your Azure Container Registry. You can't pull random images from Docker Hub. At least takes a bunch of that. And I think that's all been driven by customer need, but then we also take it, turn it into an open source project, contributed it back, in this case, in partnership with the open policy folks, get it into a CNCF project, but then also, as with Open Service Mesh, pull it back into the product. Because the truth is that for most people, they just want it to work. It's just like that conversation about developer experience and everything else. Like, great that it's open source, great that it's portable, great that I can run it wherever I feel like running it. But honestly, I want you to wake up in the middle of the night and fix it, not me, right? And so I think that's the complete circle for us in how we think about open source, is like customer need drives open project development, brought back into the project or into the product for support and interop and all of this, the easy button part of it, whether it's for PCI or for security or anything else. And you mentioned the supply chain stuff, the open SSF that we announced, and really Sarah Novotny, who has been at many a KubeCon, although I don't think she's at this one, is the driving force there. Many people in the Kubernetes community are probably familiar with her. She's been a great steward of that particular project. I think it's a hugely important one. I mean, it's sort of like, at some level, the supply chain is it's like the dirty underside of open source, right? This community, it's fantastic that we have all these communities and that we help each other. But we're one bad actor in an NPM package, 3 transitive dependencies away from a security problem, right? And we have to, as a community, just as we as a community come together to build all this software, we have to, as a community, come together to make this software secure. For my social security numbers' sake, if nothing else, right? So.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'm thinking, like, we talked, McKenna was mentioning Azure Arc a little bit earlier, and I know that when we talk to customers, and they care about security and compliance, and they might start by thinking they want to do it in their data center. Then they think, oh, I want to do it in Azure. They'll take care of everything. But then people are looking at hybrid and multi-cloud. Sean, can you talk a little bit about Azure Arc and maybe how Microsoft's multi-cloud or hybrid story plays into people's need for that, not just manageability, but also security and compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who have followed along the Azure journey, these many years, you may be familiar with many years ago we sort of rebooted Azure around this notion of the Azure Resource Manager as kind of the Uber control plane for all Azure resources to provide this kind of consistent way of not only sort of doing CRUD operations on those resources, but how you did things like policy and governance and RBAC control and monitoring and a series of these sort of horizontal concerns that exist, whether you're talking about virtual machines or databases or now Kubernetes clusters, which were not in the picture when ARM was originally developed, but obviously have snapped in over time. So the idea behind Arc was, hey, we put a bunch of investment into that really powerful control plane with a bunch of these capabilities built into it, but it's currently scoped just to Azure resources that run in the public cloud. How can we bring that capability out to resources that are running in other public clouds or in an on-prem environment? And so that was really the impetus for the Azure Arc sort of initiative, was bringing that set of capabilities to that broader set of resources. Now Kubernetes fits in there quite nicely because now you can use Kubernetes as sort of the compute substrate across all of those different environments that plugs up into Azure Arc and is able to take advantage of all those capabilities, but becomes a deployment target for all different types of workloads and even containerized versions of some of our services, right? So you can now start to deploy out things like our application services, Azure ML, data services out onto Kubernetes in these arbitrary set of environments, but have a consistent way of viewing all of those environments, applying policy in terms of what you're able to do in those Kubernetes clusters versus not, controlling RBAC configuration, all from that consistent control plane in the cloud, but applying across that sort of heterogeneous set of clusters and other resources either out on the edge or in other public clouds. So having that kind of consistent model, and I think it was Lachlan saying earlier, the single pane of glass for all of those resources with all of those consistent capabilities on top, customers are finding to be quite a powerful combination.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because I feel like from questions we're getting in the chat and from the discussion we were having earlier, I'm going to look to Lachlan and say, hey, Lachlan, sure, we might take care of all of these like things in an add-on or whatever, but what about the higher level abstraction of we're taking upstream Kubernetes and we're packaging it, we're putting it out on some sort of schedule. And can you talk a little bit about just the security and the patching, and is everything in AKS and upstream? Do we have anything that's different? What's the cadence? And I'm talking to you as someone who has been in charge of the release team for Kubernetes itself. How does Azure interact with that?
Yeah, I think that the statement has always been with AKS that we're upstream, we're following upstream. So we've put in all the guardrails to make sure that we are able to consume the releases as they come down. And I think, Sean and his team and the engineering team's done a wonderful job to build not only adequate testing to make sure that as these releases come out that we can test them and maintain a certain amount of quality, but be able to bring them into the platform very quickly. And I think, Azure's done a fantastic job for ingesting new Kubernetes releases and actually building them in a way and packaging them up in a way that is sustainable and helps products like AKS actually be rolled out and maintain a high bar of quality. I think, if you were to overlay supply chain security and these kind of measures as well, I think there's obviously a lot to look forward to in that space. It's been a big theme in KubeCon. And if I was to tie that back to, I see a lot of chatter around Gatekeeper and Azure policy for AKS. I think there's really good opportunity with that tooling to start to build in those kind of secure supply chain as defaults and offer them up as just you turn it on. So If you have an image that you wanted to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster, you could say, is it signed? Is it signed by this key? And get a yes, no before you actually deploy it. So I think watch that space. There's a great opportunity there. And I think, these use cases weren't even around when we built Gatekeeper. And it's great to see that we've built a platform that we can extend and provide a consistent experience for customers. I want to say thanks to Daniel Newman for the feedback on their experience with Gatekeeper and Azure Policy add-on for AKS. And I think there's another person, Engin. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But yes, it is GA, and we have tied that in, and you can actually go to Azure Policy and write Rego policy and apply it to something that's managed. And as Brendan said, have the support number if things are to go wrong, and have that kind of guarantee that the infrastructure is supported, and we can help you out there. So it's very exciting to see all these things come together and be extendable down the road. So, I think watch the secure supply chain space. It's definitely a big theme here at KubeCon. And I think there's plenty of opportunity for us to bring, those enterprise security requirements and meet them with tools like Azure Policy for AKS.
All right. That is awesome. And I want to, we're almost out of time, so I want to wrap up. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us a sense, bring it right back to the question that we started off with, a key trend. Something you're excited about in this, cloud native space, or something you think people should be checking out right now. And I'll start with Brendan. What do you got for us, Brendan?
Well, I'll go back to what we were just talking about, which is this open source security supply chain stuff. I think that when I've looked at this, a lot of our customers and a lot of people I talk to have kind of run ahead of where they probably need to be from a security perspective. Their dev teams may have gotten a little in front, and I think and also perhaps a little bit optimistic. I think it's been driven home to me in a variety of different environments just how aggressive the threat landscape is, I guess I would say. And once one person figures out, hey, if I social engineer a GitHub project, I can deploy code into, everybody who consumes this NPM package, 10 more people follow through that door. And so I just think that that's probably the most important thing that we could be talking and thinking about, because honestly, all the good stuff that we've built in these communities kind of hinges on us keeping them safe. And so like, if you value the KubeCon community, you need to invest in making sure that, that open source doesn't become equivalent to insecure.
That is so profound and important. So thank you for giving us that to think about. Excellent. Same question to you, Sean. Like, what are you, new trends, key trends, something that you're excited about, something people should be checking out right now?
Yeah, I think it's a theme that we've hit on a few times already in the discussion, but the notion of making things simpler. I've been joking to a few people recently that it's sort of the new Kubernetes product pitch Mad Lib is Kubernetes is too complex, therefore my product or my project. It's a bit facetious, but at the same time, there is a ton of innovation happening in that space across all different vendors and open source projects, trying to, as Brendan said, the core API is now stable, and so like, how can we take that and build on top of it, whether it's tooling or additional abstractions on top, to make the power of that underlying platform, that kind of core engine, if you will, something that is usable by sort of mere mortals, right? And so I think it's going to be messy. There isn't a clear solution yet in terms of exactly what that package looks like, that is just one click and everything's just super easy. But the fact that there's so much going on in that space and so many big brains and great product folks and engineers working on solving that problem gives me a lot of hope that, as we look out 12, 18, 24 months, that these things will get so much easier for customers and make it that much easier to consume and scale, because ultimately, that's what's going to lead to the largest possible impact for the project is if it's usable by the broad community of developers and operators and security folks and all the different stakeholders.
Fantastic and entirely true. All right, Lachie, what do you got for us? Where are we going? What's the future?
Yeah, I think the revelation for me being here at KubeCon is, we've built a really strong community, and no matter what the problem space that comes up and whatever gap, I think the sub-communities or new communities is going to spin that up, and what they've learned from Kubernetes and the CNCF, they'll be able to apply into new problem spaces. And that open collaboration and working towards a common goal, I think we're going to see that becoming more and more companies and individuals buying into that. So, whether it's WASM or eBPF, I think the heartening thing is, hey, there's a good bunch of people already in the community who are ready, willing, and able to actually start to tackle these problems. So, not specific, if I was to put my finger on one thing, but the fact that we have a system here that, I think the CNCF and through projects like Kubernetes has demonstrated that, in this continuum, hey, if every company is now a software company, is every software company an open source company? We're getting down to that line, and is open source just a way that we collaborate together and solve these problems together? So I think that's a really big opportunity. No matter the problem, we can solve it together, and everybody, it's the rising tide lifts all boats.
All right. I couldn't have put it better myself. I'm thrilled to have heard from these experts about all the great places that we've been and that we're going. I'll pass it back to you, Dion.
Thank you, and thank you all again so much for your time today. This was really exciting. Just a reminder, we've shared some links in the chat. If you have a few minutes to fill out the survey, we greatly appreciate your feedback. The event ID for today's event is 14537. That's also in the chat. And thank you again so much to our panelists and Bridget for moderating today. This was a great discussion, and we hope to see you all again soon. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.